All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our March Sustainability Forum. Thank you all for coming. Our speaker today is Alec Brownlow from DePaul University. He is a professor of geography. His research interests generally involve the histories and geographies of fear and violence in the city, emphasizing the emergence of these phenomena in various places and among various social groups, as well as their utility to urban development agendas and co-optation by urban development interests. He is currently exploring the growing rhetoric of sacrifices within the development and anti-development narratives, both within and without outside of urban context. Please welcome Alec Brownlow.
Hi. All right. Well, can you hear me all right? All right. Well, thank you, Stefan, for introducing me, and thank you for having me. My name's Alec Brownlow, and I'm a professor of geography up at DePaul University. And I have to say, I was a little bit surprised when I got the invitation to this forum. I do teach in the Sustainable Urban Development Master's Program at DePaul. But when Kirsten sent out her invitation to me, I was surprised that it didn't go to others in the program and that it came to me, because I think others were more appropriate speaking perhaps to an IIT audience of budding engineers and systems thinkers, et cetera, because that's not really my work. And when I expressed that concern to Kirsten, she said, "That's just why we want you." And so I was happy to hear that. So what I'm going to do today, what I hope to do today is give you just a sort of a primer, if you will, into how geography and how geographers, at least of my ilk, human geographers that is, are thinking about and exploring and writing about this idea of sustainable urban development or sustainable urbanism or sustainability, however you wish to think about it. Obviously I hope that by the end of my lecture here today or my presentation here today that you'll have a better idea of, some of what it is we do. Now, certainly geography is an enormous discipline. And I'd be remiss if I did, and I'd be completely mistaken if I said all geographers think and do the same things that I do, or think the way I do, or approach this topic the way I do. I mean, we have people, we have lots of incredible faculty that work in GIS and work on transportation systems and work on planning and development systems, right? Who come at this from, quite a bit different angle. But, we all speak to one another, and we're all sort of on the same page, I think, as far as this goes. Let me also say, I woke up this morning with a really bad back. And I was talking with a colleague this morning. I think I'm at that point in my life where sleeping is becoming increasingly hazardous to my health. So if I flinch or twitch or give an occasional ouch like that, if I move too abruptly in one direction or the other, if my top goes one way and my bottom goes the other, I'll be okay. All right. So let me just start out by saying that my research and those of my colleagues up at DePaul, for the most part, look at sustainable urban development, and that we're looking at sustainable urban development as a form of urban development. That is the growth and the structure of cities where the sort of primer or the sort of the prefix of sustainable is really urban development in its most modern sort of iteration or form. And trying to get a hold and trying to sort of wrap our heads around that as to what that means, what it means in terms of planning and urban development. Does it matter if we put sustainable in front of it? If it does matter, why does it matter? For who does it matter? For whom perhaps does it not matter? And so the organization of my presentation is really going to begin in the 1970s with what among we urban geographers really consider to be a defining moment, a sort of watershed moment when American cities, European cities, and others really began to make the transition into modernity, moving from a once industrial past into something quite distinct and quite different. And it's it is this distinction and this difference that sustainability will attach itself to, and which begins to open it up for inquiry, critique, et cetera, et cetera. Has anyone ever seen this image before? Show of hands? All right. Who has? Oh, okay. Ford to City Drop Dead. This is a headline from November 1975. And what it represents, and I use it in several classes, because what it represents is a truly sort of tipping point, watershed moment in urban politics and in urbanization, and how urbanization is unraveling, and then how it will sort of reemerge post-1977. This was a headline, one of many headlines, but perhaps the most famous headline, that came from an October speech by President Ford. And let me just also say, forgive me if I refer to historical events or people or personalities who you're not familiar with. During the Q&A, I'm certainly happy to clarify those. But this was a headline that emerged in 1977 following a speech by President Ford to the National Press Club. In 1977, New York City was on the brink of bankruptcy. It was struggling financially. It was struggling demographically. Strikes were everywhere. The garbage was accumulating on the sidewalks. The snow was not being plowed. And New York City, the mightiest economic, cultural megalopolis, if you will, certainly in North America, that could historically turn to the federal government for financial assistance, was being told no. And this was a monumental moment in American urban history. Now, it was a moment that was preceded by decades of industrial decline and outmigration, right? The old industries that once defined the cities of New England and the Northeast and the Rust Belt across the mid-plains, the northern plains, those days were ending, right? Taking growth, taking people, taking skills, taking taxes along with them. This was an age that he began to sort of see widely large stretches of urban decline, urban decay. The expression used at the time was the quote-unquote urban jungle, which had actually quite racial ramifications to it. Growing dissent and growing dissatisfaction among those who were not fleeing to the suburbs at the time, which of course were middle-class whites. Growing resentment, growing dissatisfaction, growing concentration, growing poverty, growing joblessness, growing unemployment, and a growing lack of services being made available to those who were not allowed or not able to flee the city. Again, growing waste, growing, the dissolution of service provision, etc., as cities were no longer able to do what cities do: just pick up the trash, just fill the potholes, just plow the snow. And certainly what Ford was sort of, the introducing, or the harbinger, if you will, of recognizing the new racial politics of the United States, where the cities were, in 1977, increasingly communities of color. African American, Puerto Rican, a growing Mexican population will emerge within the next 10 years or so, right? Recognizing the declining power and economic base in the cities vis-a-vis the growing economic power and demographic white base in the suburbs, Ford was able to tell the city to drop dead. And of course, this was sort of an extension, if you will, of Nixon, who Ford replaced after Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford was Nixon's vice president, of Nixon's own politics, sort of racialized politics of the Southern strategy, of identifying sort of white discontent and white fear, and sort of honing that to sort of what we know today is sort of the very racialized politics of left and right and of urban and suburban. This would mark the moment when really cities became blue, if we think in terms of red and blue, in terms of progressive and liberal, or pardon me, progressive and conservative. And the suburbs and the outlying suburbs, or exurbs, if you will, became increasingly red. So Ford City Drop Dead in 1975 was this incredible moment when the feds began to cut loose cities. They had the political will, they had the economic will and ability to tell cities that they were no longer politically viable, at least in the growing sort of conservative movement of the mid to late 70s. And cities like New York, and I'm going to stick with New York because cities like New York were in a bind of what to do, where to turn. Industry was no longer, the biggest player on the block. In fact, it was a quickly diminishing player. Where to turn to for revenue if you couldn't turn to the state, if you couldn't turn to government. And so in 1977, just coincidentally, this would emerge, right? I Love New York. And I was living in upstate New York at the time. I was 12 years old in 1977. And I remember the I Love New York campaign was on every TV channel. It was on every radio channel. And every kid had an I Love New York shirt. It's one of the most recognizable symbols in all of the world. In fact, when I was preparing this presentation for today at home, my 7-year-old daughter was getting her shoes on this morning, and I had this slide up, and she goes, "I love New York." I was like, "How the hell do you know that?" Well, and then she said, "Well, everybody knows that, Dad." And I said, "Oh, well, good. That's just what I wanted to hear." I Love New York would emerge in 1977 as a new way of attempting to attract investment, revenue, and what have you. It was really the first of its kind and certainly the most successful and most popular at a new project called urban marketing or urban branding. An extension, an effort, if you will, an extension out to try to woo to New York tourists, jobs, young professionals, right? Who had fled, whose parents perhaps had fled for the suburbs elsewhere or earlier. As we'll see, or as I'm going to argue today, right? This move by cities into urban marketeering and into urban branding, where cities are, at least in this sort of new global era at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, are all in a mad scramble to land investment. We can see it, for instance, in the number of cities that try to woo Amazon. We can see it in the number of cities that try to woo tourists and the growing investment into landscapes that we call in geography landscapes of consumption or sort of recreational landscapes. We can see it in, for instance, Chicago's successful bid to land Boeing the year that I moved here in 2005, right? Boeing could have gone anywhere it wanted to, but it chose Chicago. And I'm going to argue that sustainable urban development for better or for worse, has moved itself or has been co-opted into this marketeering model with a certain set of circumstances, a certain set of consequences and implications that we as geographers, or that I as a geographer, find interesting. For it to city drop dead would be followed within 3 to 4 years by Reagan's move towards, and his famous sort of implication in his first State of the Union speech, or pardon me, his first inaugural speech, that government is not the solution, but government is the problem. Now, this would also herald in a new way of thinking, a new form of governance, and a new form of policy, sort of policy making and ways of thinking about the role of government and the role of the state. Because up through 1980, and including Nixon, including Ford, right, the 70s were really sort of the waning years of what's called the welfare state. That is sort of an architecture of governance that's been built around helping out, sustaining, offering assistance to, being there for a nation's citizens. And really in the early 1980s, with this sort of proclamation that government is not the solution, but the government is the problem, we see and we're still living with, a really profound move away from the quote-unquote welfare state and towards something quite different. An architecture that's not necessarily built upon assistance or built upon being there or built upon offering a leg up to, but rather an architecture that's increasingly built around rolling back, expecting of, identifying responsibility elsewhere. So this architecture, this sort of new era, which has been, for better or for worse, termed neoliberalism, perhaps that's familiar, is really one it's sort of quasi-anti-government, at least, the idea that government should not be playing, has no role or has no business, quote unquote, being in people's lives to the extent it was perhaps over the last 50 years. It's also an architecture and ideology that's very market-led, very pro-growth, where decisions of resource distribution, decisions of, who benefits and who loses, or, how the resources of the country are distributed should be identified and determined by, quote unquote, the market, right? All right. So just quickly, this was an architecture that's built around a variety of things. Privatization, taking those areas of government that, quote unquote, should no longer be, the business of government, and selling them off. Everything from parking meters in Chicago to, to airports, to bridges, to tollways, you name it, right? One that's built on program cuts or program elimination, right? We're hearing this right now if you keep up, with what's going on at the federal level with the Department of Education, or the Department of Energy, or the EPA, or other things, right? Layoffs, service cuts, etc. And then this idea of devolution. That is that assistance should no longer be expected from the feds per se, but rather assistance in times of crisis, Hurricane Katrina, Chicago heat wave, you name it, the recent hurricane in Houston, et cetera, should really be the business of others, churches, volunteers, nonprofits. So this is the, from the Ford to city drop dead in 1977, the sort of cutting the tether, if you will, of the federal government to cities, to a growing ideology at the federal level that will sort of implicate and sort of penetrate, if you will, and sort of tendril out into all forms of state government, et cetera, of shrinking governments, of rolling back governments. again, cities found themselves within or at the end of the 70s and then the 1980s in a real jam and in a real pickle of exactly how to survive and how to persist in this new economic and political reality that, again, for better or for worse, is termed neoliberal. How, for example, did cities in the 1970s like Baltimore, which is where I grew up, or Chicago, these once industrial powerhouses, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Philadelphia, which is where I moved here from in 2005, how did these cities make this transition to go from, for instance, this is Baltimore at the top, and you should recognize Chicago at the bottom, to cities like this? If anyone's ever been to Baltimore, this is the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. I remember growing up, you could smell Baltimore Harbor from about 45 minutes away. It was just this stinking, repulsive thing. And then in 1983, when I was a senior in high school, the Inner Harbor opened it up, and it was this immaculate and immense and very impressive sort of quote-unquote landscape of consumption, complete with museums and aquaria and restaurants and pubs, et cetera, et cetera. But the old harbor, the old working harbor, et cetera, had disappeared. Or Chicago's, obviously this is an image that I purposely chose, right? Showing the sort of the same waterfront area in Chicago, moving from its once industrial past, right, into a very post-industrial, very sort of consumption and tourist, et cetera, oriented present. Now, this move has been called, among urban theorists, the move towards entrepreneurialism. That these are now this idea, we're no longer a city of production, where we produce things, where we produce steel, where we produce goods, textiles, et cetera, but rather we're we're less cities or a sort of an urban model based around production and increasingly an urban model based around consumption, right? And of course, this goes straight to sort of sustainability. All right, so this notion of entrepreneurialism, it's been out there for 10, 15 years now, right? And basically it says this: cities should now be run as businesses, where the bottom line is really one of the key sort of economic indicators. That citizens of cities, that visitors to cities should be understood and treated as consumers. And let's give the consumers what they want. A growing emphasis again on new kinds of landscapes, new sorts of landscape forms, from Maggie Daley Park to the Bean to Millennium Park to you name it, right? All efforts understood to be sort of required to be competitive, to excite, to lure, and to sort of entice into visiting, if not staying for the rest of your lives in places like Chicago. It's within this sort of context, if you will, as cities are beginning to redefine themselves and cities are beginning to compete with one another. And we're not just competing with one another regionally. Chicago's not just competing with Cleveland or Madison or St. Paul, right? Chicago's competing with Seattle. Chicago's competing with London. Chicago's competing with Sao Paulo. Chicago's competing with Munich. Chicago's competing with Cape Town, right? To try to attract mobile capital to it. Boeing could have moved anywhere in the world it wanted to. Amazon theoretically can move anywhere in the world it wants to. And to be able to land those businesses, to get those jobs, and to get the kinds of college-educated graduates, right, to occupy and to fulfill those jobs, well, you have to create a product, an urban product, that is attractive, that is amenable, that is accessible, that is clean, that is green, that is safe. And so sustainable development emerges in the 1980s, granted, it's looking at development elsewhere and in large parts of especially the rural developing world. But it will quickly be and successfully be sort of incorporated into this new form of urban development that's taking place. And very successfully so in places like Portland, Oregon, where I lived for a stretch in the 1990s, Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, right? Curitiba in Brazil, and others. And these will sort of, the success of these cities, especially on the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, their success at attracting relatively young professional workers, as well as the industries, Microsoft, Intel, Nike, right, that they do. Boeing was out there, right, still out there, will really be used as a model by other cities. Now, I moved out to Portland, Oregon in 1992, and to use Ross Perot's words, if anyone remembers Ross Perot, I was part of the great sucking sound, right, of young people fleeing the East Coast to move to places like Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, following grunge, following coffee, following craft beer, right? But if that's what drew me, what kept me is Mount Hood. What kept me was the immense park system in these places. What kept me was the coastline, et cetera, all these sort of natural amenities that cities like, well, Chicago not so much because we have this unbelievable coastline ourselves, right, the Third Coast, but that cities like, say, Cincinnati or Baltimore or others really are trying to replicate and trying to incorporate into their own identity. All right, so this is my entree into sustainable, sort of, the idea of sustainability, right? This is my ilk of geographer, that is urban geographers, urban human geographers who are interested in, well, is anybody a geographer here? Does anyone have a degree in geography, undergraduate or whatnot? Yeah, okay, all right. I mean, geographers do all kinds of things. Now, we're not planners, and we're not architects, and we're not designers. Although, I mean, we're interested in all those things. Geographers are this, depending on who you ask, the sort of the breadth of our interest is either our greatest weakness or our greatest strength. But the entree into, or at least the sort of my geographers of my ilk, urban human geographers, there are sort of entree into the idea of sustainability, sustainable urban development, really are geared towards this history and this context, and how sustainable urban development is urban development, that is economic growth, economic form, economic structure, in sort of some sustainable cloak, or with the word sustainable put in front of it. Now, maybe you're familiar with the sort of the three-tiered, the three-legged stool of sustainability as it has sort of been articulated within sustainable development discourse and rhetoric, where there's an economic component, right? Sustainable development is still development. It's growth, right? It's economic growth. It's wealth. It's profit. Let me just read this to you. This comes from Scott Campbell's sort of classic article from 1996 called Green Cities, Growing Cities, Just Cities. So he says, the growing city, which is the economic sort of stool, or the economic leg, if you will, sees the city as a location where production, consumption, distribution, and innovation take place. The city is in competition with other cities for markets and for new industries. Space is economic space for highways, market areas, and commuter zones, right? So very much a sort of economic model of, of growth, albeit somehow sustained. Perhaps what we're most familiar with, and then certainly my students, whenever I ask them what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say sustainability, it's not generally economic growth, it's green, right? It's environmental. But in its original form, the environment was really only supposed to be one of the three tiers of what was counted or what sort of was inclusive in this notion of sustainability. So the green city sees the city as a consumer of natural resources and a producer of wastes. Certainly some of the conversations I had with some of you working on projects to address this. The city is in competition with nature for scarce resources and land and always poses a threat to nature. Space is the ecological spaces of greenways, river basins, and ecological niches. The third stool, or the third leg of the stool, is always the one which, for better or for worse, tends to be the most marginalized, or tends to be the one that fewest people recognize, adhere to, or sort of infer or encompass into their own sorts of ideas, their own policies and projects. And that's the social component, right? Or what Campbell calls the just city. Because cities are, in fact, made up of people. These people are historically segregated by race, by class, by wealth, by religion, right? So what does sustainability have to say to that? The just city sees the city as a location of conflict over resource distribution, of services, and of opportunities. The competition is within the city itself among different social groups. Space is the social space of communities, neighborhood organizations, labor unions, the spaces of access and segregation, right? So sustainable urban development, what I find to be really compelling sustainable urban development scholarship, discourse, et cetera, begins to recognize the competing agendas among these three. The conflicts, the opportunities, right? Now, oftentimes those opportunities tend to take place between economic and green, the growing city and the green city, where sort of, the business leaders and sort of the growth modelers increasingly understand and are able to quantify the value of being green, right? People seek green. Look at Portland, look at Seattle, look at San Francisco, look at these other cities. There's an agenda. There's a very understandable and a very identifiable relationship between green and growing, and oftentimes sustainable sort of politics, sustainability projects, et cetera, really tend to emphasize those two components. What will this new park, what will this new waterfront, what will this new water system mean for economic development, right? The social oftentimes and too often gets lost in the mix, right? The social justice component. And it just so happens that social justice in urban cities is really where geography has its bread and butter, right? I don't know if anyone has ever read or even heard of David Harvey, Social Justice in the City, but urban geographers and urban geography really has its one foot firmly in the door, and sort of we identify with, perhaps most at the outset, the idea of justice. We are a group of social justice academics, especially up at DePaul, where we're a small department of 8 faculty, most of us urban, and most of us very rooted in inequality, unevenness, the uneven distribution of housing, the uneven distribution of economic or environmental benefits or economic or environmental burdens. We do environmental justice work. We look at gentrification, among these other things, right? Also Neil Smith, whose picture's at the bottom here, right? And so it's this, it's this component of the sort of sustainable urban development agenda, or trifecta, if you will, this social justice component, where at least I find some of the really compelling work is being done. And granted, it's kind of marginalized compared to economic and green work, right? But it's an absolutely fundamental piece of this body of scholarship. So let me give you just a couple of examples before moving into my own research about just what this kind of, what this might look like. So this is Nathan McClintock. He's at Portland State University. And I use Oregon, I use Portland oftentimes in my classes because it's sort of synonymous with, and it's held up as sort of the apical example of, what it means to be a sustainable city, right? It's the place of, again, tremendous architectural sort of and engineering models, access to grapes and wine and access to coastlines, et cetera, et cetera. Sustainability is working its way and has, very successfully and very actively and consciously been, worked its way into everything from transportation ideas to, again, building and roads. This is one of the first bike share cities, et cetera, right? It's the city, again, of coffee houses, of hipsters, and not what, right? And as the bottom image says here, great cities don't happen by accident. They're very much happen by conscious decision-making. And in the case of Portland, Oregon, for instance, as McClintock has shown several times over and over, Portland was only made sustainable and attractive by years of, either by hook or by crook, pushing its historic African-American population east and away from the quote-unquote sustainable downtown, the kind of images that we all attach to Portland. They've moved, quote-unquote, east of 82nd. They've been picked up and relocated, displaced to, east of 82nd. They are out of sight, out of mind. In fact, there are very few people who even live in Portland that realize that Portland, Oregon has a substantial African-American population. The gardens that are grown, the kombucha, stores that are going up, these are all made available by once African-American property. The term ecological gentrification, is anyone familiar with that? No? All right. So the term ecological gentrification is out there quite a bit now. Melissa Checker, working out of NYU, was one of the first to sort of coin the term, working at Harlem, and basically in her work realizing that years of environmental justice activism and politics in old African-American communities around New York, but especially in Harlem, the moment they became successful, i.e. cleaning up brownfields, i.e. getting new parks made, i.e. getting new sort of green infrastructure put in, that was quickly followed up by desirability. So the term she uses is ecological gentrification. And as she says, it describes the convergence of urban redevelopment, ecologically minded initiatives, and environmental justice activism in an era of advanced capitalism, what I just described as neoliberal. Operating under the seemingly apolitical rubric of sustainability, environmental gentrification builds on the material and discursive successes of the urban environmental justice movement and appropriates them to serve high-end redevelopment that displaces low-income residents. A trend that she calls the sustainability paradox. In other words, after years of fighting for cleaner neighborhoods, for cleaner yards, for cleaner landscapes, the environmental justice sort of activist and movement finds itself on a knife's edge of how clean should we really go? How clean should we really be? If, in the end, all of our fruits and labors, all of our politics and activism are going to be the death of us, are going to be the end of us. We won't be here to enjoy and experience its fruits, if you will. Now, my colleague up at DePaul, Wynn Curran, answers the question with, quote-unquote, just green enough. And this is a book that just came out within the last couple of weeks. And it's based on her work in Brooklyn, where she's working with an environmental justice group in a particular neighborhood called Greenpoint, and she's finding that the desirability to go green is there, but there's the realization that Brooklyn is a very desirable place, so let's just leave it slightly toxic, lest we be displaced. All right. This is also some of my own work, some of my own early work was in this area. I moved to Chicago from Philadelphia in 2005. I was teaching at Temple University there. Any Philly people here? No? Okay. And I was working in a community in West Philly called Cobbs Creek, which is historically African American, right? And some of my early work on this community, working especially in an urban forest along its boundaries, began to look at questions of resource redistribution, right? So as Philadelphia made its own sort of move into an entrepreneurial model with declining budgets and declining tax bases, resources or, sort of budgets for things like parks, which were largely a luxury, began to be picked up and redistributed around the city to parks and to neighborhoods that were more politically powerful, more perhaps visually compelling than Cobbs Creek, right? The paper on the right, Between Rights and Responsibilities, looks at, for instance, the role that local people are playing in Cobbs Creek in trying to wrest control of a restoration project, of the ecological restoration of this particular urban forest in ways that will prevent, again, their displacement. Just to the east of this community is the University of Pennsylvania, which is rapidly moving west. It can't move east because that's downtown Philly. It's rapidly moving west. It's called petrification, right? And this is a community that fears that the restoration, the long-needed ecological restoration of their adjacent forest will be their demise. And so they're trying to wrest control of it. They wish they could restore it in a way that everybody else is restoring their forest, but they realize that that's perhaps not an option. All right. Now, most of my work, as Stefan read my little blurb there at the beginning, most of my work is on violence and fear and the roles these things play and how they're sort of changing themselves within this new era of sort of neoliberal urban development, right? And this has occupied probably the last 10 years of my research or so. Some of the early work that I just mentioned to you in Cobbs Creek has a lot to do with fear and violence in that particular park. But what I want to do here is I'm not going to go, this isn't going to be a research-heavy, portion here because there's all kinds of stuff that's very sort of involved. But given what I've just said and how I've just presented, how we as geographers are thinking about sustainability in this new sort of era, and some of the politics and the critiques behind it, I hope you'll appreciate how this particular portion of my work fits into that. All right. So I'm going to close on this, but, and then we'll take it from there. All right, so I was living in Philadelphia. I moved to Philadelphia in 1999. I was a graduate student up in Massachusetts. I was moving to Philadelphia to do my research on a Ford Foundation grant, working again in Cobbs Creek. And while I was there were two parallel stories unfolding in the Philadelphia press. The first one was this woman on the left here, Shannon Cheever, who was the daughter of a wealthy Washington, D.C. couple. She was a master's student at the Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League student, right? And she was living in Rittenhouse Square, which is downtown Philadelphia. It's akin to sort of the Central Park West. Amazing homes, amazing lofts. Very expensive place to live. She was living there, and one night she was attacked, raped, and murdered in her room, right? In her apartment. And it was an enormous scandal, because of who she was, a young, white, professional, wealthy woman, University of Pennsylvania grad, right? Her story got an enormous amount of media attention. Her parents, of course, made sure of that as well. Her father was a Clinton appointee. Her mother was a very prominent fundraiser in the D.C. area. upon investigation, it was learned that she was the last of several attacks in the Rittenhouse Square area, none of which had been reported or recorded properly by the police. There were at least 4. They all reported their accounts to the police, and the accounts were so similar that it was quite apparent to any officer that there was a serial rapist and a serial attacker that was working around the Rittenhouse Square area. But these 4 original reports were what's called black boxed, or downgraded, or put into another category so that their occurrence was not known to people living in the Rittenhouse Square area. The crimes were buried. I mean, to put it in sort of, layman's terms, the crimes were buried. But that would end with Shannon Schieber. I don't know if you recall, it made national headlines, the Center City rapist who would be caught in 2003 out in Colorado. The second headline, or the second sort of parallel story that was accompanying the Shannon Schieber case, was an investigative report in the Philadelphia Inquirer by 4 investigative reporters that were looking at crime data going back decades, back to the 50s, which found a pattern and a persistence and a narrative, if you will, of massive underrecording by the police of rape, involving tens of thousands of victims whose reports never made it to the public record and never were included in official crime rates or crime statistics. Now, in doing so, in this sort of pattern of doing so, and by the way, it's a pattern, again, that went back decades. Those crimes not making their way to the official crime rate and official FBI statistics lowered Philadelphia's crime rate significantly. And beginning in the 1970s, Philadelphia's own branding sort of exercise or their own emphasis would focus on safety. That Philadelphia was the safest large city in the United States, and it had the crime stats to prove it. Uh-oh. All right. So, for instance, on a special Dateline, NBC Dateline called Justice for Shannon, which was about this case, the narrator asks Mark Vezlola, who was one of the 4 investigative reporters from the Chicago Tribune, why had the Philadelphia police downgraded crimes, erasing alleged rapes from their own files? The Philadelphia Inquirer reporters believe a message had filtered down to every level of the police department, that downplaying crime had become part of a culture to make the city of Philadelphia seem more crime-free than it actually was. A form of salesmanship to lure tourism and business. There's the entrepreneurial sort of hook there, if you will. Mark Vezlola, again, one of the reporters, is quoted as saying, the political message from the mayor, from our mayor, and our police is that Philadelphia was extraordinarily safe, that it had the lowest crime rate among the top 10 most populous cities in America. And if you look at sort of brochures and websites that were, sort of marketing to conventions that were used, for tourists, et cetera, safety is always prominent. It's always front and center. Now, at the time, Ed Rendell, a Democrat, a very powerful Democrat, was mayor of Philadelphia. But again, this went back decades to include progressive as well as very conservative and, controversial mayors like Frank Rizzo on the far left here, black mayors as well as white mayors, what have you, right? No female mayors. So this lure of economic growth, this lure of being able to compete, I mean, poor Philadelphia has New York City just 50 miles to its east, and Washington, D.C. just about 80 miles to its south. The political, economic, and cultural hubs of North America, and Philadelphia was trying to carve out some sort of niche here. All right. I published a piece on this work, right, a few years back called Keeping Up Appearances, Profiting from Patriarchy in the Nation's Safest City, basically making this argument that safety, along with being clean and along with being green, is a very marketable commodity, right? As we choose to decide where we want to live or where we wish to visit or where we hope our kids go to school or to college, what have you, right? Safety is way, way up there. What I wanted to know next, right, was of these tens of thousands of victims whose crimes have been hidden in Philadelphia. And let me also say, I didn't put up the slide here, but there's, at this time, there were a large number of sort of tell-all accounts by former police chiefs, former cops, et cetera, basically making the claim that, listen, this happens everywhere. It's part of police culture. It's what we do. This is how we were trained, right? Crime, sexual violence, crime against women, for whatever reason, doesn't constitute quote-unquote real crime. There's any numbers of ways that police sort of explain this. But the question I wanted to know was, who were the drivers of this pattern? Who are the drivers of this trend? Because I can't imagine that Shannon Schieber was very exemplary of that, right? In fact, as I already said, Shannon Schieber's, death was picked up by the media on a daily basis, rapidly, and very, very sort of emphatically pursued by her parents, et cetera, et cetera. So who constituted the sort of the collective victimhood, if you will, of whose parents weren't powerful and popular, or whose the media wasn't picking up? And that's what I've spent about the last 5 years trying to figure out. Because these people are invisible. These victims are invisible. They're so invisible that their crimes don't appear in crime stats. Their victims, their recollections or their reports to the police don't appear as rape or as sexual violence. They've been downgraded to something else. So is there a way to figure out who they are? And that's what I've been trying to do, right? With the assumption being that Rittenhouse Square and Shannon Schieber is not exemplary of this pattern. In fact, this was a pattern that she was a victim that, quote unquote, should not have been a victim. But rather, probably most of the victims, if not all of the victims, came from the city's west and north sides, largely African American, maybe some Latino. I've spent the last several years trying to find a model, trying to come up with a model using, very available crime data made available by the FBI to try to identify and try to sort of tease out invisibility, because these are invisible victims. This is a kind of invisibility that's being capitalized upon in the name of safety, or towards the sort of production and the representation of safety. And I think I've done it. And I've used St. Louis as my model, and I'm looking at other cities around the country. This is an article that should be available any day now. It's coming out in the March issue of the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, called The Uneven Geographies of America's Hidden Rape Crisis, a district-level analysis of underpolicing in St. Louis. All right? So in my own way, looking at safety, if not necessarily looking at clean and green, but understanding safety as part and parcel of the rhetoric of entrepreneurial sort of attractability and attractiveness. Again, I think this new area of my work is trying to find out some of the unjust, the unjust, the uneven, and just the sort of downright scandalous mechanisms behind the promotion of cities in this new kind of form. So I'll stop there, and I'll take your questions. Thanks very much. Is that for me, or is that for them?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Over the past 10 to 20 years, there has been a large amount of development in the near downtown area here in Chicago. There's a lot of construction going on now. What basically do you think is the driving force of all that construction? 30, 40 years ago, the near downtown area was nothing like what it is now. It was more run down. Now it's very upscale. Again, basically, what are the primary reasons that has driven all this development?
So if you're talking about the South Loop and the West Loop in particular?
Correct.
All right. The West Loop, it's a good question. And I think, proximity to the loop is certainly one of them. Proximity to the lakeshore, especially for the South Loop, is one of them. I know that there are arguments out there that Harpo Studios was one of the major factors in the West Loop's development into what it is, right, today, along Randolph and along Madison, going out to Ogden or so. That Harpo Studios, by attracting the audiences on a daily basis that she did out into the West Loop, where Harpo was surrounded by meat packers, by warehouses, et cetera, that Oprah Winfrey was a one-woman gentrifying sort of power in the West Loop. Now, obviously, there are other explanations there. The availability of abandoned capital, the availability of abandoned buildings, of warehouse space that could be easily turned into loft space and rolled over for an enormous amount of money. The South Loop, the South Loop I know was the old red light district of Chicago back in the early 20th century. The old Chinatown was located in the South Loop, and it was displaced a little bit further west to where Chinatown's located today. It was an area of high prostitution. It was an area of, just sort of the seedy underbelly, if you will, of industrial Chicago in the early 20th century. Its development, what are the drivers of development on the South Loop? Again, I think access and proximity to the loop and to the lake. It's not necessarily well fed by public transportation, although I guess the orange, the green, and the red lines all run through it, so maybe I'm mistaken there. But I know that, I don't know, I'm sure that those histories exist and those rationales and arguments exist of why the South Loop and why the West Loop, why not the Southwest? Although, certainly we can look at Pilsen and see, the tea leaves have been written in Pilsen years ago, that Pilsen will be the next great gentrifying, or is already in the throes of massive gentrification. But not Little Village, not Humboldt Park necessarily. So that's a roundabout way to say I don't really know what the drivers are, especially in the South Loop. But I think the argument's been made, and I think it's a relatively logical argument that Oprah arrived in the West Loop when it was still largely either abandoned or industrial, and that by attracting the audience on a daily basis that she did, an audience that had to stand in line for ages, perhaps wanted an espresso or a panini or something while they waited, that there was a slow iterative process, but that once it took off, it really took off. So thanks for the question.
So I have a question. You mentioned about the intersections between the three pillars, right, in terms of the city development. So just city, green city, and growing city. And you mentioned, and then you presented your work in terms of safety. I'm curious to hear from you what are existing mechanisms to prevent some of the unsustainable development that are happening. If you have any examples where that has been successful, you mentioned Oregon, but I wonder where are the mechanisms for decision making in that process that you have came across, if any?
Well, I mean, I think all I have to do is look at the political landscape. I think the politics, there's an enormous amount of ambivalence and an enormous, if not downright resentment to things like mixed income housing, or lead developments. If you look, for instance, at the Cabrini Green area, and Cabrini Green is just being representative of the other large housing, mid-20th century housing projects in Chicago. A lot of the justification there, there's ample justification for tearing down Cabrini Green. It was a long process. But those households and those living spaces were to be replaced by mixed income. This was the policy of mixed income housing, sort of up to date with, sustainable, sort of sustainable architectural principles and design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it didn't necessarily come to pass the way that housing activists and housing advocates would have expected it to, right? So, for example, the whole ideology of mixed income housing is that, most of it will be market rate, but there will always be some set aside for below market rate housing, right? To accept some of the folks that were displaced from Cabrini Green. People that live in market rate housing don't necessarily want to live to non-market rate housers. So there was a feeling and a very sort of palpable dynamic of resentment towards those that were living in below market rate, largely African American, if you will, versus those that were living in a $800,000 or $700,000 condo next door. There's not a lot of incentive by developers to produce below market rate housing. There's a lot of incentive not to. There's very little political will to sort of upkeep it. So, in answer to your question, most of the politics, if the question was, what are some examples, or what are some examples of sort of combating what it is I talked about? Most of that's happening at the grassroots level, where, again, the just green enough movement or the just green enough politics, people are and communities around the country are becoming very savvy to the kinds of projects and the kinds of policies that have the potential, if not the likelihood, to displace them. And so, there's a lot of this work and a lot of that kind of politicking and a lot of academic work like that. It's quickly moving its way into environmental justice and social justice kind of writing and scholarship, where the environmental justice movement, for example, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you're at all up to date with environmental justice or environmental racism, was really about, the unequal exposure of communities of color to urban hazards, right? Landfills, factories, polluted rivers, polluted air, the Fisk and Crawford power plants, et cetera, et cetera. Environmental justice work today is quickly moving into this sort of the politics of displacement and sort of fighting those at the grassroots level and, et cetera. Does that help answer your question? I mean, I don't know if you're asking, is it being implemented from the top down? I imagine in some places it is, right? Places like Oakland, for example, where Oakland has, for whatever reason and for years, despite its proximity to San Francisco, has not experienced the kind of, property crunch and just, vaulting property and real estate prices that San Francisco has. I mean, it's just a bridge away. Access to San Jose and to Silicon Valley are pretty simple from Oakland. And I think, the argument could be made, and I think the argument has been made that, Oakland politics has been very conscious of how it's developing. It wants to develop. It doesn't want to remain the sort of the ugly stepsister of San Francisco. But at the same time, it's undergoing a kind of planning process and policy that is very conscious and very conscientious of its demographic and its population. San Francisco, I think, if you were to look at the demographics of San Francisco, it's less than 10% African American. If you look at the demographics of Oakland, again, just a bridge away, it's probably 75% plus African American, right? Oakland is trying to become sustainable and, sort of design and plan its way forward with that reality in mind, and trying to sustain that particular demographic in whatever way it can.
Hi.
Hey.
There was a very interesting presentation covering a wide array of topics. What I was interested in knowing is that you showed a picture of Chicago like when it was when there were industries, and now how it is. So it's not that, we can't assume that those industries shut down, right? They just moved to a different place. Mm-hmm. So the drawbacks of having those industries move to a new place is that the liabilities just shifted from Chicago to that other place. So that is not a very sustainable development either, right? You're just shifting the liabilities. So how does that work? Because if we want to address the issue of sustainable development, it should be a very all-inclusive development, not just focus on one area.
Agreed.
Do you get what I'm saying?
I understand entirely what you're saying.
Okay.
Now, whether industry is shifted south to Wheeling or to Gary, Indiana, or whether it's shifted to parts of the southeast, right? Or whether it's shifted to Mumbai or to Shenzhen or what have you, right? I mean, consumption is real. People want to consume. And there have to be producers. So, I mean, it does. It begs the question of how sustainable is deindustrialization and the greening of the modern city, when really all you've done is you've taken that old industrial infrastructure and you've moved it and you've concentrated it in China, in India, in Bangladesh, and in other parts of the world, right? You've just displaced the problem. My own work on crime and fear does the same thing, right? So I look at the additional policing resources that go into neighborhoods. The gangs don't go away; they just move, right? You've shifted the problem elsewhere, but the folks who live there is like, all right, now we've got this great, safe neighborhood. Listen, I think, there's been a lot of argument made and a lot of sort of critique of sustainability and what really constitutes sustainability if you're just taking the problem and you are placing it on a different group of people. Whether it's a place like Gary or whether it's a place like, Mumbai, Delhi, Dhaka, you name it. So, critical theory, as it's looked at sustainability work, is very conscious of that and has argued forcefully that, the model of sustainability as it's being pursued in practice, especially in the West, Europe and the United States, is hardly a model for sustainability at all if you're just poisoning other peoples and other landscapes. I can give you a couple of names of people to read if you'd like to think about that. Can I just come out there? I feel silly just standing my hand here. Are you done? Are you asking a question? Oh, you're just the mic. You're just the mic guy.